Statistics and facts about gun control you need to know. American, Australian, and European myths about gun control. Do more guns cause more death? Is gun control security theater? Let's look at some graphs. Okay, homicide rates in US states and Canadian provinces. Chart. Blue is US states, red is Canadian provinces. There's clear regional differences in many cases. States in the far north and far northeast of the United States report very low homicide rates, while certain homicide hotspots, apparently in Missouri, Maryland, Illinois, and the Deep South, are driving up U.S. rates. There's no such thing as an American homicide rate. In the U.S., 54% of counties have no murders in a year, while 2% of counties have 51% of the murders. So if you're outside of big metropolitan areas, statistically speaking, you are actually pretty safe from being a homicide victim. Now let's look at some countries where stricter gun laws were passed and whether or not homicide rates were affected. United Kingdom. After the United Kingdom tightened its firearms laws in 1997, and with the latter virtually banning the private civilian possession of handguns in Great Britain, the mainland, the homicide rate still increased until it peaked in 2003. Canada. As you see from firearms regulation in Canada, gun laws became more restrictive in the years 1951, 1969, 1977, 1991, 1995, 2001, and 2003, and were slightly loosened in 2006, 2012, and 2014, with the non-restricted rifle and shotgun registry abolished outside of Quebec. I don't see increasing the restrictions on firearms as reducing the homicide rate. Australia. Take a look at this graph. Part of the reason that the collection of homicide rate in Australia is so recent, a recent phenomenon, is because it has tended to be so rare. Politically, it simply wasn't a national priority. Australia is a small country, with only a few more million people than Florida, spread out over an entire continent. In the relatively high homicide days in the early 1990s, Australia's homicides totaled around 300. This means in a bad crime year, in which homicides increased by only 20 or 30 victims, it could swing overall rates noticeably. A report from 2007 titled Gun Laws and Sudden Death. Did the Australian firearms legislation of 1996 make a difference? Also noted that homicide rates were already falling prior to the National Firearms Act being enacted, and found that the NFA didn't speed up the declining rates of homicide in Australia. More recent studies still find that the decline of homicides cannot be attributed to the NFA, hence non-firearm homicides also sharply declined in the same period. There was a more rapid decline in firearms deaths between 1997 and 2013 compared with before 1997, but also a decline in total non-firearm suicide and homicide deaths of greater magnitude. Because of this, it's not possible to determine whether the change in firearms deaths can be attributed to the gun law reforms. In fairness, a review of the literature from Harvard did find that states that had more guns brought back experienced more rapid declines in homicide. However, considering Australia was experiencing a decline in non-firearm homicide at the same time, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly how much of an effect the NFA actually had. Even the review admits that no study was able to explain exactly why gun deaths were falling. The claim that Australia has had no mass shootings since the NFA is also blatantly inaccurate. For example, there was a school shooting in Melbourne in 2002 that killed 2 and injured 5. The 2014 Sydney siege, where a man armed with a shotgun took a cafe hostage, also shows that despite the NFA, Australia has been unable to get rid of gun violence in public places. Why gun control doesn't explain Australia's low homicide. Republic of Ireland. After 1972, when restrictions on possessing firearms were significantly increased, the homicide rate still increased. Gun control was tightened in 1972, and the homicide rate. Jamaica. After gun laws were tightened in the 1970s into the most restrictive in the free world, Jamaica's murder rate still increased. Gun laws has tightened in 1974, and here's the murder rate. Now let's contrast this to the Czech Republic. In the Czech Republic, the number of homicide rates decreased, while the number of legally owned firearms increased. Legally owned firearms in the thousands, hence total number of homicide victims. Within the United States of America, we see that as more states passed permissive laws in concealed carry, the homicide rate lowered. The homicide rate also lowered as gun application hence increased. And another graph. Wikipedia's file right to carry timeline.gif shows that more states today have shall issued who conceal carry permits or even permitless carry than in the past. Again, do more guns cause more death? As you can see, there's no correlation. In fact, if you run the numbers, the correlation hence coefficient is 0.1, which suggests a negligible correlation or none at all. The murder data is 2012 data from the Justice Department. The gun ownership rate data is from a 2015 report called Gun Ownership and Social Gun Culture. Just for good measure, I also went in and looked for a correlation between mass shootings and gun ownership rates. Here, I took the total number of mass shooting victims in all states so far in 2015. This is updated constantly by Mass Shooting Tracker and includes the most recent Oregon mass shooting. Mass shootings here include a shooting involving 4 or more people and do not necessarily mean school shooting. This can mean someone went nuts and shot his wife, her lover, and 2 bystanders at a birthday party when the shooter personally knew all of the victims. There are not just cases of random public shootings. If we only included those, the total numbers would be microscopically small, even with all mass shooting data together. It's obvious that your odds of being involved in one in any given year are vanishingly small, and less than 1 per 100,000 in 48 states. I've included all victims, not just as fatalities here. If I used only fatalities, the mass shooting numbers would match smaller. There's even less of a correlation here, negative 0.006. Now, I've noticed is when someone points out the lack of correlation here, gun control advocates are quick to jump in and say, but you didn't control for this, and you didn't control for that. That's true. But what I do show here is that the situation is far more complicated than one would think from absurd claims like states with fewer guns have fewer murders and so on. Apparently, claims that new gun laws are commonsensical can't be true if the relationship between gun laws and murder rates require us to adjust for a half a dozen different variables. In fact, by looking at the data, I could imagine any number of other factors that might be more likely to determinant of the murder rate rather than gun ownership. There's no correlation between gun ownership, mass shootings, and murder rates. The District of Columbia mandated trigger locks and banned civilians from purchasing handguns after 1976. But the homicide rate still soared, while the rest of the country's homicide rate declined. And after the trigger lock law and handgun ban was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2008, the murder rate actually decreased and didn't increase again until 2014, 6 years later. Chicago's 1982 ban on new handgun owners has completely failed to lower Chicago's murder rate. The murder rate fluctuated between 1982, when the handgun ban came into effect, and 2010, when the handgun ban was lifted. Concerning the types of weapons used in violent crime and overall numbers, according to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's expanded homicide data table 8, murder victims by weapon, 2015-2019, handguns are used to kill more people than rifles, shotguns, and other guns combined in a given year. Rifles and shotguns combined are used to kill less people than knives or cutting instruments, blunt objects, even and personal weapons, like hands, fists, feet, etc. And this includes non-assault weapon rifles and shotguns in with assault weapons, so the actual number for assault weapons is going to be lower. There's places with lots of guns that are not that violent, such as Kennesaw, Georgia, which requires every household to have a firearm, and Svalbard, Norway, which requires everyone to know how to use a rifle against polar bears. I also mentioned Northern Ireland. Well, sure, the USA has gang violence, hence social authoritarians and religious rivalries. The USA never has armed religious warfare, but in Northern Ireland, despite a smaller population to cause trouble and less landmass to hide in, there has been open and armed conflict between Catholics and Protestants, with tension lasting to this day. And virtually every law enforcement officer who carries a firearm, unlike most of the UK, which has dedicated authorized firearms officers and specialist firearms officers, who's equivalent to SWAT. I'd attribute the root of Northern Ireland's violence to their culture, which affects politics. Northern Ireland's conflict between Catholics and Protestants dates back centuries, and it seems that there's a number of people who won't let go of hard feelings. Restricting inanimate objects, such as weapons, hence isn't enough to address the actual disease rather than the symptoms. When it comes to what causes crime, culture is by far the most important factor. Let's compare Latin America and Southeast Asia, sampling Mexico and Thailand. Mexico is richer and better developed than Thailand, but has a far, far, far higher homicide and violent crime rate. The political commentator Actual Justice Warrior, no intent to promote his other politics here, has argued that crime drives poverty, not the other way around. Much of America's culture of violence comes from the South, which is culturally of Scottish descent, as Scots and other low-class British people immigrated to the American South for easy agriculture and the warm climate, as talked about by Thomas Sowell in his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. He concentrates on this in his excerpts, The Origin of the Redneck Culture from Britain, and The Origin of Pride and Violence in Black American Culture. Another thing to look out for is data manipulation. Generally, there are two ways of collecting homicide data. We can collect it from the law enforcement agencies, and we can collect the mortality data from medical examiners and other medical personnel. Much of the time, however, what counts as a homicide can be rather subjective. In fact, as the Los Angeles Times noted back in 2007, Japanese officials are often biased against autopsies and tend to minimize the number of deaths that are declared homicides for purpose of padding the percentages of solved cases. Police discourage autopsies that might reveal a higher homicide rate in their jurisdiction and pressure doctors to attribute unnatural deaths to health reasons, usually heart failure, the group alleges. Odds are, it says that people are getting away with murder in Japan, a country that officially claims one of the lowest per capita homicide rates in the world. You can commit a perfect murder in Japan because the body is not likely to be examined, says Hiromasa Hasegawa, a former member of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Security and Intelligence Division. He says senior police officers are obsessed with statistics because that's how you get promotions, and strive to reduce the number of criminal cases as much as possible to keep the almost perfect solution rate. Japan's annual police report says its officers made arrests in 96.6% of the country's 1,392 homicides in 2005. But Saikawa, who says he became disillusioned by fishy police practices and in 1997 left the force in disgust as after 30 years, claims that police try to avoid adding homicides to their caseload unless the identity of the killer is obvious. All the police care about is how they look to people. It's all PR to show that their capabilities are high, Saikawa says. Without autopsies, they can keep their percentage of solved cases high. It's all about numbers. This article also details some of the corruption behind Japan's highly suspect 99% conviction rate. Moreover, one is likely to find suspiciously low homicide rates in many authoritarian countries in Asia, such as China, which is clearly manipulating official data on a variety of issues. Even in Canada, there are issues around reporting and compiling homicide data, although there is no indication of deliberate deception. This document notes that there are persistent differences between the mortality data and the data from law enforcement agencies. In the U.S. as well, it is important to remember that the mortality data put out by the CDC includes justifiable homicides simply as homicide. In other words, if a violent maniac breaks into your house and you shoot him dead, that will be included in the CDC's official homicide rate. In practice, it's likely that the U.S. is far more liberal in its counting of homicides than numerous countries. For example, infanticide in the U.S. is generally counted as homicide, although that is not the case in some other jurisdictions. The Odysee reports. Nonetheless, the challenge of cross-national comparability are considerable. National legal systems may have different thresholds for categorizing a death as intentional homicide. Whilst intentional homicide usually requires that the perpetrator purposely intends to cause the death or serious injury of a victim, in some countries a death that occurs in the act or attempted act of another serious crime may also qualify as intentional homicide or murder. Infanticide, assault, leading to death and killings carried out by law enforcement officers, acting legitimately in the line of duty or not, all may or may not be included in police recorded statistics. In addition, differences in police recording practices, such as differences in counting units, offenses, suspects, or cases, whether or not attempted homicide or non-intentional homicides are included in published figures, and the point in the investigation at which a suspicious death is classified as homicide all vary between countries. A few gun laws, New Hampshire is safer than Canada. Also remember that correlation isn't causation. One can find correlations between U.S. spending on science, space, and technology, and suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. Or the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool in films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Or per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by becoming entangled in their bed sheets. Seriously, those are the first three examples that are on Tyler Vigen's website, Spurious Correlations. And he's also written a book by the same name. Now, what you don't know about gun laws around the world. Would you feel safer in the countries of the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, or the U.S. states of California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York? What do these states and countries have in common? All the aforementioned countries have shall issue licenses to carry a concealed firearm, while the aforementioned states have may issue licenses to carry a concealed firearm. In other words, it's easier to get a license to carry a gun in 5 European countries than it is in 8 U.S. states. And in Poland, it's legal to carry black powder guns without any license, as long as the weapon was designed before 1885 and can't use metallic cartridges. And in the Czech Republic, it's legal to carry single-shot or double-barrel black powder guns without a license as well, making the Czech Republic and Poland and constitutional carry or permitless carry for black powder guns. What a process to legally buy a gun in Europe is lengthier than most of America. Legally buying a gun in many European countries is not as hard as people think. And saying that it's harder than legally buying a gun in America is not that simple either. Let me explain. According to Overview of Gun Laws by Nation, Wikipedia, 20 European countries, the largest of which are France and Poland, shall issue for issuing licenses to own firearms, with a strong majority of them allowing centerfire, semi-automatic rifles and pistols, and another 2 countries, Norway and Hungary, seem to be shall issue or close to it. 4 countries have some firearms to be owned even without a license. And I'll list the country and their situations in regards to firearms restrictions. Permitless, this means no permit or license is required to possess a weapon. Permitless for air guns: Belgium, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands, Sweden, United Kingdom. Permitless for antique and black powder firearms: Belgium, Croatia, Czech Republic, France, and Finland, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom. Shall issue for a license to possess firearms: Albania, Andorra, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Lithuania, Malta, Monaco, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Poland, San Marino, Serbia, Slovakia, Switzerland. In contrast, the following U.S. states and territories heavily restrict or prohibit the civilian possession of assault weapons: American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, District of Columbia, California, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Hawaii. Assault handguns are prohibited. European countries that are permitless for modern firearms: Andorra, Austria, Greenland, Monaco, Switzerland. In contrast, the following states that require a permit to purchase long guns: California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Jersey, District of Columbia, all U.S. territories. New York City requires a permit to purchase with a limit of 1 rifle or shotgun plus 1 handgun on every 90 days. Australia, or at least the state of Queensland, by comparison, limits the purchase to 1 firearm per 28 days. And in Canada, there's no limits for non-restricted firearms. shall issue concealed carry licenses: Europe, Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. The following U.S. states and territories have May issued concealed carry license: California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, United States Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Northern Mariana Islands. Despite the fact that it's hard to get a license to legally carry a firearm in California, New Jersey, and New York, these three states still deal with a lot of crime, and despite the fact that it's easy to legally conceal carry a firearm in the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, all of which are rather poor by European standards, these countries are perfectly safe countries to be in. This still holds true for the 12 other European countries are also shall issue who possess handguns, and the 12 European countries that don't require and the 12 European countries that don't require a permit to obtain an antique firearm. 16 European countries have shall issue licenses is for centerfire semi-automatic rifles such as the AR-15, but assault weapons are still rarely used in crimes in these countries. This again still holds true for the 5 European countries that don't require a permit to acquire long guns. Keep in mind that just because a country isn't shall issue doesn't mean that it's particularly difficult to obtain a license. Permissive may issue exists, such as in Slovakia, which means that licensing authorities almost always issue licenses even though they can deny licenses. Countries that are permissive about carrying or at least owning knives are Austria, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and Lithuania. But all these countries are still perfectly safe to be in, and knife violence is not endemic. I'd also like to mention that in Canada, before 1969, anyone, even children and convicted murderers, can legally buy firearms other than handguns or machine guns, and even those don't have too many restrictions. But had a few murderers committed with shotguns, rifles, or even semi-auto rifles or shotguns. As shown in the video, Canada's gun-friendly past. In America, you need to go through a background check and fill out a form in order to purchase a firearm from a dealer. Even in states in which you don't need a license or permit to purchase as a firearm. NFA weapons are a whole nother ball game. And here's some bonus graphs. Please support the Substack blogs America vs. Europe and the World and Arguments Against Leftism. Here's my social media link tree, which I ask that you keep archive. You keep the link and archive my content. And please.